We're back with the most boring fighters in the UFC, back with the middle school presentations. Now, usually in the UFC, every now and then there'll be a boring fight, a fight that you take a break. More often than not, it's women fights, but there are some males out there who are boring more often than not. And I know there's one fighter beginning with B that you're all going to bring up, but there's a lot more than you think, and I'm going to be taking a look at some of the most boring fighters in the UFC, at least from my perspective from what I've watched. I can't remember these guys having any interesting fights, or at least not for a long time. Starting off with Israel Adesanya, but as a defender. Now I say as a defender because a lot of his fights, at least in the recent MMA, I know he's had a few fights where he's defending his belt that were fun, obviously knocking out Whittaker, and the Pereira fight the first time weren't that bad. But it seems for Adesanya, whenever he's fighting for the belt, he becomes way better. They say that you're 10%, or not 10%, but they say you're a lot better as a champion rather than a defender. But from Adesanya, I feel like he's way better when he's not champion. He fought Gastelum. That was a really interesting fight. And then the second Pereira fight knocked him out cold. And then even the Blachowicz fight was interesting. And obviously that wasn't a defending fight, that he moved up to claim the light heavyweight belt. But then you look at his defences. Jairo Cannonier was boring. The second Whittaker fight was boring. The Yoel Romero fight was boring. The Vettori fight was boring. The Costa fight was interesting, so I'll give him that. But I've just seen a theme with Adesanya that whenever he's fighting for the belt, it tends to be a lot more of an interesting fight. He'll either get the finish or he'll go through hell to get it. But whenever he's defending, it's literally just the most minimal point fighting ever. He doesn't seem like he wants to win when he's defending. Maybe it's just a wake-up call. Obviously gets KO'd by Pereira, so then maybe that's a wake-up call. Maybe from now on he's going to be a lot better, but I've just seen that Adesanya's a lot better when he's fighting for the belt rather than defending. So I've just noticed it. He seems a lot more point fighter when he's defending it. Like I said, I'm not saying he's never had an interesting fight as a defender. The first Pereira fight was slow, but it was somewhat interesting. The Costa fight was interesting, and so was the Whittaker one. But there's just a recent theme. He fights Whittaker, or he fights Vettori, it was boring. Then he fights Whittaker, I think it was in that order anyway, boring. Then he fights Cannonier, boring. And obviously the Yoel Romero fight was boring. And we saw Cannonier versus Vettori, and that was actually a really fun fight. The one they had a couple of weeks ago was really a fun fight. So it just tells us that Adesanya is the one making it boring. So I'm going to go Adesanya, but I'm going to say as a defender, because he tends to have a lot more interesting fights when he's fighting for the belt rather than when he's defending it. So Adesanya as a defender for me is quite a boring fighter. Moving on, I'm going to go for Alexander Romanov. Now, if you're a fan of the heavyweight division, you would have seen Alexander Romanov. He's just really boring. He's not a bad fighter. I mean, he's only lost once, I think, to Marcin Tybura. He's coming off a win over Blagoy Ivanov, who's not even in the UFC anymore. And his entire game plan is just slamming people and laying on them. He's got terrible cardio. I think it was the undercard of Pete Yan versus Marab. He fought Alexander Volkov. His gas tank went after 30 seconds. Even the Marcin Tybura fight that he lost, he dominated Marcin Tybura in the first round by laying on him, and then his cardio was gone. He has terrible cardio, absolutely terrible, barbaric cardio. He's just really boring. Like I said, his entire game plan is laying on them. The only highlights of this guy's career is when he picks them up and slams them. That's it. Apart from the slamming, it's literally just laying on people. He's so boring to watch. Terrible cardio as well. Alexander Romanov is one of the most boring fighters. He's just boring. Maybe sometimes he can lock up a submission or a ground and pound finish, but overall it's just laying on people. If you look at his highlights on YouTube from in the UFC and outside the UFC, a lot of it, like I said, will literally just be him picking people up and slamming them, because that's just what he's best at, because he's so big and fat. But apart from the slamming, he's got nothing. It's just laying on people. He's really boring. Not interesting to watch at all. Yeah, Alexander Romanov for me is one of my least favourite fighters, just because he's, well, maybe not one of my least favourite fighters, but it's never an exciting fight. No one ever gets excited to watch Alexander Romanov. He's boring. Up next, we've got Jai Herbert. He's got so many losses in the UFC as well. I think he's only won twice in the UFC out of like 8 fights, 6. I don't know how many he's had, but he hasn't won that much. I spelt Leon Edwards wrong. He's basically just a terrible Leon Edwards. I know he trains with Leon Edwards and stuff from the same place, and he trains with him, but he's just a terrible Leon Edwards. And I thought this guy was like young. I thought he was younger than Leon Edwards. The guy's 35 years old. I don't think Leon Edwards is older than 35, but the guy's 35. I thought Jai Herbert was in his 20s. This guy's 35. I think he's 35. He might even be older. He's between 35 and 40, but he's terrible. He's a terrible Leon Edwards. He's just point fighting the entire time. He always ruins UFC London. I don't know if he's ever fought outside of London. Every single one of his fights are in the UK. But he's so boring. His last fight with, I think it was Fares Ziam at UFC London Fight Night Aspinall Tybura, it was so boring. It was the most boring fight of the card. It was literally just both of them clinching the entire time. He's just really boring. He was literally just point fighting, leg kicks and clinch work that entire fight. And before that, I think it was UFC 286. He fought Ludovic Klein, and it was a draw, but it was a majority decision draw. I know it wasn't Jai Herbert's fault necessarily, but it just wasn't an interesting fight. Even when he fought Ilia Topuria and got knocked out cold, that was somewhat an interesting fight, but it wasn't like a banger. The only part of that fight that was interesting was him getting slept. He did beat Kyle Nelson by decision, and he did every other fight is a lot. Well, he beat that other Donny Edges going the Costa Vittori fight night, but a lot of his fights tend to be really boring, is what I'm saying. He just point fights. It's basically just a leg kick. He's got good kicks, I'll give him that. He's got really good kicks, but apart from that, nothing. Can't grapple to save his life. He's terrible, he's boring, he's only hyped because he trains with Leon Edwards. He always ruins UFC London. Like, when has this guy ever made a good fight on UFC London? He hasn't got long left in his career. Very boring is Jai Herbert. And talking of the guy that Alexander Romanov fight, I'm going to go Marcin Tybura. Just come off a KO loss to Tom Aspinall. He's boring. He nearly got denied a main event with Aspinall due to nobody knowing him. Apparently Aspinall was supposed to fight someone else. Like, I think it was meant to be Tatu Ivaza or something, and then no one was free with Aspinall. And then Aspinall requested to fight Marcin Tybura, and the UFC were close to saying no because nobody knows Marcin Tybura. He's very, very boring. I think he's a ranked heavyweight, or he was when he fought Aspinall. He's got so many decisions on his record. I don't think he's won a fight by finish since 2021. But he's very, very boring. He's kind of like Alexander Romanov, just pinning people down to win. He's more of a striker. He does tend to strike a lot. The problem with Marcin Tybura is, I'll give him props, he's very durable. He doesn't give up easily. He's a durable fighter, but that's the problem. He's so durable that he refuses to go, so he just drags the fight on longer, and he's just a bunch of nothing. Even the win over Alexander Romanov that he had, he was just so slow. It was just point fighting on the feet. It was so slow. It was boring. I don't know how he's a ranked heavyweight. He just shows the levels that you need to be. Like, you look at heavyweight and bantamweight, you need to be a 9 out of 10 fighter to even get in the rankings. Marcin Tybura, he's just not great. He's not exactly fun to watch. No one knows who he is before the Aspinall fight. Pretty boring. Yeah, he's just very slow. Yeah, he's well-rounded. He can wrestle or he can strike, but it's not like he doesn't have that like, you've got people like Derek Lewis flatlining people, or people like Cyril Gane showing skill, and you've got this guy who doesn't really have any of it. Like, I don't want to shame him too much, but he's just not interesting to watch. And finally, the one everyone wants to see, Belal Muhammad. He's boring. He is boring. I don't think I need to explain why. He is probably the most boring fighter in the UFC. So many decisions on his record. Like, he had one decent fight recently with Sean Brady at UFC 280, and that was it. Apart from that, it's just so many boring. Like, how many decisions did he have on his record? The Gilbert Burns fight wasn't that interesting at UFC 288. The Vicente Luque fight was boring. It was just laying on him. Stephen Thompson just laid on him. Damian Maia just laid on him. Diego Lima laid on him. He hasn't. When was his last finish? Before Vicente Luque, his last finish was 2019, and before that it was 2016. He's just a really boring fighter. I don't think I need to go into too much detail why. The problem is with Belal Muhammad, he's winning a fight, so this guy's actually going to be fighting for a belt soon. Belal Muhammad fighting for a belt is probably going to be one of the most boring title fights in history. He's improved his striking, I'll give him that. He's definitely improved his striking. You can see with the Sean Brady and the Gilbert Burns fight, he outstruck both of them. But no matter what he does, he's just really boring. He's just really boring. Like, laying on people, and even the striking is just point fighting. He's got a good body kick, decent body kicks, but he's just really boring. I don't think I need to explain why. Everyone knows it. Remember the name, remember the decision. It's Belal Muhammad. But yeah, that is my list for the most boring fighters in the UFC. Please let me know if you agree with any of this, or if I missed any names that I should have mentioned, please let me know. But yeah, this is my list of the most boring fighters in the UFC.